Good afternoon, colleagues. A very warm welcome to the joint MDB Pavilion, and it's great to see this room so full. My name's Gerard Howe. I am the head of the FCDO UK Government's Adaptation, Nature and Resilience Department, and I'm delighted to be moderating today as we go through the session. So on behalf of the IDB and EIB as co-chairs of the Nature Group, I welcome you to this session. And this is a really important session. I'm sure many people here have been talking throughout COP about the importance of action and the importance of showing progress. And we're here exactly to do that today, to update ourselves on the progress that our colleagues across the MDB groups have been making of their commitment made 2 years ago in Glasgow. So we're delighted to be here with you. As I said, this journey started in my hometown of Glasgow 2 years ago as we committed alongside you to nature-positive investments and recognising the critical role of the multilateral development banks in so doing. I'll say a few opening remarks, then we'll turn to a presentation and panel remarks from our colleague agencies. So just for a scene setting from the UK perspective, we just recently launched our development white paper on the 20th of November. And a critical element of that white paper was it for the first time set as an integrated goal, a single strategic goal, ending poverty and tackling climate change and biodiversity loss as a single challenge. It didn't distinguish between them because it recognized the interlinked challenges between all three. And again, I think that's why we're here today. And here at COP28, a key priority for many of us, the UK included, is a dramatic increase in both the quality and the quantity of finance for climate and nature. And of course, we all know that the Multilateral Development Bank Group is absolutely critical to this, to delivering on the SDGs, to delivering on Paris, to delivering on the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. And we are seeing good progress. On climate finance, we're seeing progress. We know that currently MDB public finance accounts for over 40% of climate finance for developing countries in 2021. And MDB's own climate finance reached nearly $100 billion in 2022, 60% of that for MICs and LICs. And we welcome recent statements from the World Bank Group and the IADB on their own ambitions for climate and nature financing. But on nature finance, we know there is much, much more to do. The GBF agreed at COP15 included a collective goal to increase finance to at least $200 billion a year by 2030. And we've seen today, with OECD figures being published, the multilateral institutions provided $7 billion outflows in 2020 and $5 billion outflow in 2021 towards nature, far less than on climate, so there is much to do. In Glasgow, we agreed together a joint statement on nature, people and the planet, and 10 multilateral development banks committed to mainstream nature in 5 critical areas: leadership, tackling drivers of biodiversity and nature loss, creating synergies across systems, valuing nature, and enhancing public reporting. And the joint statement also agreed to develop tools for tracking nature-positive investments across MDB portfolios. And today, we're going to hear about the fruits of that commitment. As I said, we're coming to hear about progress, which is really encouraging, and hear about the common MDB principles for tracking nature-positive investments. Graham's going to talk us through that. And a key step is what that will do is to help us identify and accelerate the quantity and quality of finance supporting the Global Biodiversity Framework. And as such, we strongly welcome it. It will inform and illustrate our commitments and critically provide consistency, credibility and dialogue about what counts. This is a journey. This journey has already taken 2 years. It will take more. But we recognise that doing this journey together is really important. And we hope that a step in our future journey is a joint nature finance report. We've done it for climate, and with these principles, we can do it for nature in due course. And finally, as with so many things here at COP28, this is brilliant, it's important, and it's necessary, but it is insufficient. Alongside this work, we need to see MDBs aligning full portfolios with Paris, meeting the goals of the MDB-GBF alignment, collaborating on joint methodologies on nature finance to set targets, and together continuing to lead and mainstream nature ever more deeply into every aspect of their institutions and their operations to meet the future challenges that lie ahead of us. So thank you very much indeed. I really look forward to the discussion today, and we're going to start off with a presentation from Graham Watkins from the IDB with where we are on the principles. Thank you, Graham, over to you.
Thank you so much. Let's see. Yeah, I think we're up and running. Glad to see so many of us are still alive and have made it so far. Hopefully you'll make it through the last few days as well. I'm just going to add some more color basically to what was already said in terms of explaining what we've been doing and what we've been trying to achieve at the end of the day. I wanted to emphasize one point though. I think collectively we all think, no, this is super important for the future and for our own agendas as we move forward. I would emphasize that for IDB and IDB Invest, it's particularly relevant given how Latin America and the Caribbean are positioned in the world with respect to biodiversity. And yes, it does come from the joint statement on nature, people and planet that was signed at COP26. And basically the commitment there, and I'll read it out, is to seek to develop tools and methodologies for tracking nature-positive investments across our portfolios. So that was the commitment we made, and this is what we're trying to follow up on. Took 2 years of work. That's actually quite quick compared to other things that we work on together. So I'd like to congratulate everybody that was part of the process to get there. We worked very closely with Trinomics and also with the Climate Policy Institute to be able to deliver this. And so I also wanted to say today we're launching it. Today, I think you should be able to find it on all of our websites, hopefully, provided all of the systems work in banks, which they always work, it's always the state. How did we do it? We actually looked at everything else that was going on to be able to develop these methodologies. That means looking at OECD DAC's approach to the analysis of nature-positive finance, talking to IUCN and looking at what they were doing with respect to nature-positive finance, looking at also the climate tracking methodologies and learning from those climate tracking methodologies. As you're aware, there are two, and they're quite different in terms of their approaches. And a lot of discussion, a lot of back and forth, a lot of movement, a lot of emails late at night, particularly from those trying to lead and move the agenda forward. And so what was actually produced in the end? It's basically a set of common principles that can help guide how we do our work. They define nature-positive finance. They define the criteria, the eligibility criteria for basically identifying and therefore tracking nature-positive finance. And they really start putting in place the steps to identify what that finance is going to look like ex ante. And I'll emphasize this a couple of times. What's the purpose of the actual document is really that they can be used by the MDBs. So we're already, for example, beginning to use this, and I think we'll go through a panel discussion and we'll all talk about how we're using them. But they're also informative for investors to look at as well, and I think that's an added value. They really are intended to help us ex ante look at what we're putting into the system and be able to track and then report on that so that we can answer some of these questions about how much our MDB is investing in this area. We will need to and are already working on internal methodologies. It's very similar to the process that we adopted for Paris alignment, where you have an overarching set of principles and methodologies, but then those have to be landed in banks, because banks are different. Each one of us is different, and I mean, I know directly from our experience that IDB is very different from IDB Invest. Our internal processes are very different. We need to think about how do you land that inside each of the banks. They'll also, and this is perhaps the most crucial part of this, facilitate the comparability amongst the banks. So you're looking at a diverse set of banks that do slightly different things, but having the principles will help us actually think about and be able to compare what we're doing from across all of the banks. So we've tried to define nature positive in a way that is relevant to the way MDBs program and define and develop their portfolios in general, which is challenging in the first place, because as I've said, they're quite different. And what the definition that we've sort of come up with is nature positive finance refers to finance that supports actions that protect, restore, or enhance the sustainable use and management of nature or enable these actions. So that's basically the fundamental starting point. And the idea is really to connect with the work that we're doing to implementation of the Global Biodiversity Framework and its broad ambition basically to halt and reverse nature loss by 2030. So what counts as nature positive finance? It needs to meet all of the following eligibility criteria. It needs to make a substantive contribution to nature. It needs to have expected positive outcomes for nature that are measurable, which can be quite complex, and it is not supposed to introduce, obviously, significant adverse environmental risks or impacts. So, but it has to meet all three of those criteria. This doesn't mean that we can't also count other things. And for example, IDB and several other banks already have methodologies for counting green finance. Within green finance, there's often biodiversity finance generically writ, as it were. So you can track additional categories beyond nature positive as well as tracking nature positive. So the idea of the common principles is therefore to be able to allow the banks to account for the co-benefits of with climate finance as well as nature finance. So we can actually look at the cross-links between climate finance and nature positive finance as well. There are also principles and guidance as the same as climate finance on how we're going to implement this, how you're going to apply this. Rule number one, it's ex ante. That should be pretty obvious. I mean, that's the same way that we do climate finance. It's about direct finance and tracking those commitments. They should be applied conservatively. The process should be applied conservatively. There should be granularity in the application, and you should be able to clearly track both climate and nature co-benefits in the process. In terms of the way forward, the principles also offers us sort of it's not a starting point, it's like a halfway point or even a halfway point. It's another step in a long journey, as it were, from which we can launch to move further things forward. Next steps are to look at things like developing an eligible list of activities that you can put into a draft taxonomy for investment. Several of the MDBs, and you'll hear this as we move forward, will be piloting next year as we move forward. And I'm going to sort of finish here, but I do want to emphasize that, climate finance wasn't built rapidly overnight. We've been doing it now 13 years, or if not more. Somebody can correct me. It's been a process. It requires that constant connection and discussion amongst the MDBs to improve the methodology. The methodology is looked at every now and again to basically improve it and change it and make it better. And obviously things change externally, which means that you have to do that. So I just want to emphasize that this is an ongoing process. You have all the MDBs in front of you. Hopefully you'll ask questions about it, but we see this as continuing and improving as we implement. So I'll stop there, and hopefully that was enough of an introduction to what this is.
Thanks so much, Graham. Right, with Graham having set the scene for us, we're now going to hear from our colleagues in individual institutions in terms of how they're taking it forward across that spectrum, as Graham said, of consistency but institutional specificity. So we're going to start with Valerie from the World Bank Group. Thank you, Valerie.
Thank you, Jared, and happy Nature and Ocean Day, everybody. We made it. And I want to start first by reiterating what Graham said, that this is about a journey, not a destination. We're not anywhere close to the destination. But I wanted to take a moment, because we're in the MDB pavilion, to step back and think about the journey of MDBs in this space. Because when the World Bank, for example, was stood up in the 1940s, it was an infrastructure bank. It was set up to rebuild Europe. It continued working for decades on linear infrastructure, which we know is important. In the 1990s, we began to realize, we asked the question, who are we building infrastructure for? And we remember there were people. And if we were going to end poverty, we couldn't do it just through infrastructure. We had to work on human development and make it all sustainable in a very loose way. This was the time of the Rio Convention, a very loose sense of sustainability. Let's not let the roads rot. Let's figure out how to keep them. Let's not destroy too much of the environment. But in the last few years, we have seen this incredible, yet again, turning of the wheel. And we're in the third generation. I think all of us, all of the MDBs have had different histories where now we really realize that we cannot end poverty unless it's on a livable planet. Because we've seen, whether it's because of COVID, because of conflict, much of which is driven by natural resources, too much, not enough, or because of climate change, countries are facing obstacles not of their own making. So we can only end poverty if we create a livable planet. And we've seen this evolution. And we've similarly seen the evolution happen within the banks in terms of biodiversity. And this is where I'm going to set myself up for failure a little bit, because I'm going to disagree with Jared just a little bit in terms of the MDBs starting to think about nature a couple of years ago at COP26. It was an incredibly important inflection point. But in fact, all of us MDBs have had biodiversity specialists for 20, 25 years. I was incredibly fortunate when I joined the bank 20 years ago to get to work with giants of conservation. People like Tony Whitten and Kathy McKinnon, Claudio Sobrevilla, may they all rest in peace, Gustavo Fonseca, may he rest in peace. People who came to the MDBs to really change the conversation. And at the time, there was a small group. We were all basically, for all intents and purposes, hiding in the basement. We weren't part of the big conversations. And the Heads of Nature group was more a support group, where we would get together among the MDBs and say, hi, I'm Valerie, I'm a biodiversity specialist in an MDB, and we'd hug each other and talk about how hard it was. That really has shifted in the last 3 or 4 years to the point where, starting and accelerating with the UK push in COP26, we're now not in the basement anymore. In fact, there's a big spotlight on all of us. And we're reporting to our presidents, telling them what they're doing on nature, pushing us to do more on nature. It is a fantastic time, and it's because we recognize we cannot meet our ambition to end poverty unless we deal with nature, because we'll never have a world without poverty and a world without nature. And so that's how we got here. And then, of course, when we started talking to each other, we began to identify, so what are we spending? Because MDBs, we're brothers and sisters, but like all siblings, we can be competitive. And we wanted to talk about who's doing more and who's doing better. And so we all started to talk about what we're spending. And we realized that we can only identify direct investments, and even their direct investments largely in conservation. That's how our accounting systems were set up. And that's why you see such small numbers as $5 billion as a family of MDBs in 2021. The bank alone, when we started looking just the last 3 years at our financing, we went from less than $2 billion in 21 to $2.8 billion spent in 2022 to $3.7 billion spent last year in FY23. But what we realized was this is small numbers for an institution like the World Bank, just on the public sector side, where we invest $70 billion every year. So we realized we're missing something, because we know we're doing more work than just our direct financing of national parks or a direct financing of restoration or species conservation. And that's when this idea, again, spurred on by the UK and other partners, to come up with an accounting methodology, just as we did for climate co-benefits. And I really do want to give a shout out to Greg and to Ava, who's standing over here from the EIB, who really have kept us on track. They've been the people sending the late night emails and trying to herd a group of cats to get us to this point, which is really, really impressive. And for us, having these joint principles matters, and it has allowed us to now go and think about the operationalization. Because each of us banks, even though we share many of the same shareholders, we have different accountability and decision-making systems. And so we have to operationalize it differently. We now have a path forward. We have a way to operationalize this that we're going to start piloting next year. It's focusing on tagging nature finance in 3 different buckets. And this is all looking at where are we doing conservation and restoration, where are we doing work that will change the direct drivers of biodiversity loss, where are we doing work that is in other sectors using nature-based solutions that supplant using grey infrastructure, and where are we investing in the enabling environment? So looking at those 4 buckets of types of activities we've come up with in the bank, translating these joint principles into 3 types of investments. The first, probably the least important, is nature impact finance. It's the money we spend to make sure that we create no net loss across our portfolio, because we have something called the Environmental and Social Framework, and our Environmental and Social Standard number 6 is clear. We need no net loss in our environment. It's our safeguards portfolio. Then we have a pillar of investments called nature mainstreaming, which is where we know we are doing good for nature, we are investing in nature, but it may be in the context of a sector that we know is an indirect driver of biodiversity loss. So where we're doing, for example, nature-based solutions on a road, but we know from road ecology that working in the linear infrastructure sector, you are creating indirect pressures on biodiversity. And then we have, of course, nature positive, which is going to be a small slice, which is really about where do we have that measurable difference, as Graham was saying, in biodiversity. And we know we are not introducing, in the sector in which we are working, any indirect pressure on biodiversity. But as Graham said, this is just one step in a long journey. We want to get the taxonomy, we want to pilot this, we want to begin to really understand, as we did in climate, how much money beyond the small slice that we've been looking at, how much are we investing in biodiversity? But ultimately, the next step, where we as a group of MDBs are going to go, how do we measure our impact and how much bang we're getting for that buck? First, we have to identify how much bucks we're spending. Next, we're going to have to look at impact metrics and see what kind of a bang we're having for a buck, because in a world with limited finance, we've got to scale up what works and close down what doesn't. Thank you.
Thank you, Valerie, for both setting the context for that and providing that inspiration. I'm now going to turn to Adonai from the EBRD. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Gerard. And first and foremost, I'd like to thank the Inter-American Development Bank and the EIB colleagues for, in particular Greg and Eva, for co-chairing the MDB working group and for leading the work we're launching today, the common principles for nature positive finance tracking. Secondly, I was hoping to speak before Valerie, because she's such a good speaker that it's always hard to speak after her, but better luck next time. Today we celebrate a milestone. MDBs working together in something complex, something meaningful, and achieving that kind of work together. And in the prep for this panel, Eva was asking about a journey. I'd like to summarize our journey as EBRD in 3 key points: the journey, the experience we had, what we found we had as experience on Nature Positive, and the inspiration we gathered from working with all of you together. The journey, Valerie pointed it out very well. We had previous experience, but the journey kind of bespokely started ahead of the COP28 Joint MDB statement on nature, people, and planet that frame our thinking on nature finance. When we first brought this topic to our larger bank, that was received with some skepticism, I must say. Because we're a private sector focused institution, because we're a project finance focused institution, and because our region, the former Soviet Union, lies on an extremely degraded set of ecosystems and depleted environmental infrastructure. But thanks to this work and thanks to the work with all of you, we realized that we found our voice. We realized that we had much more experience than met the eye. And if you want the paradigmatic example of that, is an example I always share, this Northern Dimension Environmental Partnership, where we actually invested systemically with several other MDBs in wastewater treatment plants around the Gulf of Finland, which yielded very tangible ecosystem benefits. So in a way, and that was monitored by the Helsinki Convention, systematically monitored. In a way, we found out that we were doing nature finance or nature positive finance before nature positive was a thing. And that was a great realization in a way. We realized that our ethos as EBRD was the recovery of degraded ecosystems, target 2 of the GVF ended up being. And that has inspired us in many things, right? In launching activities in the 5 dimensions of the joint statement, but also in working with some of you here, and I see our colleagues from IFD, in replicating the NDP, this Northern Dimension, in the Mediterranean, that was launched in this same area on Saturday, 2nd December. It feels like ages back, but it was just a week ago. That was a replica and an inspiration on the work we've done collectively. And even more recently, we've launched our EBRD Nature approach, which revolves on 3 pillars. Some of you were here early in the morning at 9:30, so thank you for sharing with us that moment. We based our nature approach in 3 pillars. The protection of biodiversity, and that links to the update and review of the environmental social policy, the framework that Valerie referred to. Investment, that is exploring new areas for scaling up nature action and finding new projects, and disclosures based on our PNFD pilot and how we can work together with other entities like the GBIF in sharing our project data and using our data as a global public good. And I want to conclude to say that to a great extent we've done this and we've shaped our nature approach based on the work with you as a source of inspiration. So working with you all, has been an inspiration for us to realize what we had done in the past and what we could do in the future as a private sector focused, project finance-based institution, and acknowledging that we all share, even though our business models are rather different, we all share the same objective, which is bending the biodiversity loss curve by 2030 and scaling up nature action. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Adonai. Colleagues, I'm going to ask for your help. We have a series of presentations, and there's a point in the agenda where it says, Gerard, sum up. Now, there's going to be a lot of information. At that point, rather than me trying to do it, I'm going to turn to you and ask you to give us some ideas of how you're hearing this come together. So I'm just giving you advance warning of that now. Thank you. I'm now going to turn to Graham, if that's okay, to talk us through the IDB's experience. Thank you.
So as not to bore you, maybe you can think of me as being Greg Watson right now. We're both chubby, we're both GWs, and our presidents keep mixing us up as well. So, but anyway, he's American, I'm British. But actually, I think I do want to emphasize, Greg is the person that's been leading this. He happens to be in another panel moving forward. We made a commitment, all of us together, to basically work on leadership, nature positive investment, fostering national and regional synergies for policy and being able to move forward policy issues, valuation for nature for decision making, and reporting. That was our original commitment going back in time. Just rapidly on the leadership side, and I'm going to focus on IDB and what IDB has been doing. We're right in the middle now of developing a new institutional strategy. We've already seen the roadmap from the World Bank, but we're going in the same direction. We're basically going to go towards 3 frontal goals, and one of those goals is basically global public goods, climate and biodiversity. So that's a change that's coming, and we're working on it right now. We're also moving forward with a biodiversity and natural capital action plan, which is something we've been working on for a while, but that then puts biodiversity on the same par as climate. It's sort of a matching parallel document. We are already mainstreaming climate, biodiversity into our systems, and interestingly, biodiversity is with climate. So we're synergizing the connection and therefore being able to use the staffing that we already have on climate to basically expand and move the work forward. This includes the fact that we have 20 countries with specialists in the countries, which I can tell you off the bat that that's a major jump forward that allows you to have these dialogues in the countries, with the sectors in the countries, and basically move the needle in the countries. But so they're now talking climate and biodiversity. Not all of them, but we're getting there. They're starting to move. This means we're also mainstreaming into our country strategies. That will get stronger once you have an institutional strategy that says you need to focus on these issues. Then that discussion becomes part of the narrative and dialogue in the countries. Just like other banks, we're also looking at TNFD and looking at nature dependency as well. So this is, I mean, it's experimental, but we're thinking about it and trying to work out what that dependency looks like. We're really focusing and trying to be, this is the wrong way of saying it, clever about new instruments and looking at financial instruments, because biodiversity is complex. There aren't really that heavy revenue streams associated with it. It's the same sort of problem as adaptation. So we have to think about it differently. You have to think outside of the box. We are looking at it in terms of results-based financing. So we've launched here, before COP, but also thinking about moving forward with pilots with what we call IDB Klima, which is basically looking at biodiversity and climate, but results-based in countries to be able to move the agenda forward. We continue to move forward our Amazon Forever program here at COP. This is growing rapidly. We have about 5 billion allocated to the Amazon. I want to emphasize that we're doing this working jointly with the World Bank. We signed an agreement with the World Bank and other partners across the whole area. We know that we're not we know that we need to work together with everybody to be able to look at the Amazon and move that agenda forward. So there's a huge emphasis on collaboration across all groups. And just FYI, because it happened this week, we approved a policy loan for Pará, which is $300 million to actually look at how Pará can actually change its systems to move the agenda forward. We announced here with the government of Sweden, we're looking at how to use guarantees to basically expand our envelopes in countries to move that agenda forward. And interestingly, we've had a lot of success with our version of the Ministries of Finance platform, which is regional, and we're now bringing together the Amazonian Ministers of Finance so they can discuss what are the fiscal issues, the financial issues, the innovations that they can bring into play. So I think on a leadership front, we're continuing to try and work that forward. I have a lot of long lists, so I'm going to try and summarize some of the stuff, but on nature positive investment, we're also looking at new and different kinds of ways to move the needle forward. We've been actively involved with the DFC, with the Nature Conservancy, and various other partners in debt for nature conversions. Now, I know this is not bringing new finance. It's basically, I'm not a finance person, but basically it's remortgaging your house, getting a better rate, and then using the savings to be able to support conservation. But when I look at it from a conservation perspective, I used to be the director of the Charles Darwin Foundation in Galapagos. We would be very happy if we could find $500,000. They now have a trust fund of $400 million. That's a big difference. That's unheard of in a lot of parts of the world in terms of conservation. So high impact in the conservation world, interesting mechanics in terms of being able to do these deals in countries. We're working on biodiversity credits, a lot of talk here about carbon credits and things like that, but I think we need to be much more sophisticated about how we approach the question of credits, how we develop them. We actually believe that there may be something in terms of being able to create markets that are actually much more encompassing, that look at biodiversity, look at the co-benefits, look at carbon, etc. So we're looking at that as well. We've touched on tokenization, which is something else that's been discussed, habitat banking policies. We actually spent a lot of time working with Uruguay, and if you haven't looked at it, but the sovereign sustainable linked bond of Uruguay actually has a biodiversity target inside it. And we're looking, just like the World Bank has looked at things like rhino bonds, we're starting to look at jaguar bonds, just because we have jaguars, and I like jaguars. No, it's not because I like jaguars at all. But anyway, species bonds and things like that. We're also looking at so-called NACs, natural asset companies, and the launch of those on the New York Stock Exchange. And I mentioned already this work with Para, but that work is all focused around building capacity for payment for ecosystem services and developing the bioeconomy. In essence, how do you make a standing forest worth more standing than being cut down? This is the fundamental question. We also, in terms of looking at policy, are increasingly working on policy. And again, I think that the story of, you have to look at this as a journey. We weren't working on this 4 or 5 years ago. We've begun working on this. And the same with climate. If I go back 10 years, we were probably working on climate policy only in 5 countries. We're now working in 20 countries on climate policy. We're beginning to do that same rollout with biodiversity. And how do you incorporate biodiversity into decision-making, into policy with respect to nature-based solutions, which we know that that's one of the big limitations for the implementation of nature-based solutions. How do you make policies coherent within governments? We all know that one of the major challenges is subsidies, agricultural subsidies that are perverse. How can we work that into the system and have those discussions to move the agenda forward? Then just to finish off quickly, because I don't want to take up a huge amount of time, we're also, and here I'll admit, the World Bank is a leader on valuation processes, but we're starting to look at that as well. We're starting to think about, if you can start to demonstrate these values, then you can start to think about what the markets are for those values, and you can also use those as communication tools for talking about policy changes with governments. So we're looking at natural capital valuation. We've done some interesting studies, both of reefs and mangroves, but also forests throughout the region. And then finally, reporting. Internally, we're already reporting, just like many other banks, on these issues. Our board insists that we report, so we report to them regularly. And we will be using these general principles. We're right, just because we're in the institutional strategy, we're also discussing right now the corporate results framework of that, and whether or not that has to incorporate a nature positive finance indicator, or whether or not we subset it. And so we're already in those discussions, and so we will be reporting internally on these issues. So thanks very much.
Thank you, Graham, for channeling Greg as well. I'll now turn to Jamie from IFC. Thank you very much indeed, Jamie.
Thanks very much. Is this working? Good. Let me add my kudos and congrats to Ava and Greg and all of the MDB leads on this one. It's such a foundational step, and it's a baby step, but it's a foundational step for all of us to up our game. I won't repeat what Valerie said. We're operating as a group on this one. Everything she said, ditto for IFC. What I will speak to is the private sector. Now, investment in directly in non-revenue generating conservation, which has historically dominated this arena, is not the space of the private sector. So I'm thrilled that these principles allow us to capture the private sector role. And there we're really talking about transformation of economic activity, the modality of production and consumption, which currently is not benefiting nature. More than half of the global economy is either moderately or significantly reliant on nature for its output. And yet, ironically, the sectors that rely most heavily on nature for their output are the key drivers of biodiversity loss through those 5 key drivers we all know, of land use change and climate change, etc. So the key is, how do we capture and motivate these different models of economic activity? And these principles allow us to do that. And for IFC's part, we have been piloting the approach on our business, and are looking forward to expanding that and using it to increase, innovate, and pilot new approaches. Almost more importantly for us is our role as private sector development banks. Our money is always a drop in the ocean. Our job is to catalyze the private sector. Our job is to mobilize private finance. and our job is to move markets. So in that context, IFC's energies have been on helping other private capital to embrace and adopt this space. And where are we, Irina? 12, 18 months ago, we launched a biodiversity finance reference guide in the market. It's the first of its kind. It resonates and is aligned entirely with the joint principles we're discussing today. And it neatly sits within the market-accepted green loan and bond principles to drive those markets, which are now, in emerging markets, we're talking about a $200 billion a year market in labeled bonds. We've done the homework to make sure that links with the Kunming-Montreal Principle. So we've worked with the Secretariat for the UN Convention to make sure that all of the activities are linked to the ambitions of that framework. And broadly, it supports investment under 3 categories. So number 1 is biodiversity co-benefits. So that is that tweak to the economic activity of production or consumption that has less impact. Is it drip irrigation to reduce water and fertilizer use? Is it filters on ballast tanks to reduce invasive species movement? Is it plastic recycling? All of these aspects where in carbon we're well ahead. We're all comfortable that climate finance includes transitioning power generation from fossil to renewable. We've got to do the same thing in a number of different sectors to reduce the drivers of biodiversity loss. So number 1, biodiversity co-benefits. Number 2, integrating nature-based solutions into large-scale infrastructure. Can we construct wetlands rather than grey infrastructure for water purification? So, and number 3, coming back to where I started, which is conservation and restoration. And so that's sort of REDD+ and typically carbon finance with a biodiversity benefit. So those are the 3 areas that we're trying to actually drive the private capital markets into. Getting good progress with banks and issuers who are looking at their own portfolios, looking to issue biodiversity bonds, and you can watch that space for the next wave of growth in the labeled finance markets. And we're also trying to give, so that's at the capital markets level, and then at the sort of corporate level, the how-to on this. We just published a sort of white paper for feedback during COP, actually, on a practical catalogue of nature-based solutions for water utilities, for mining companies, for renewable energy companies. And we've been having some fantastic discussions and debates during this week with a number of leaders from those sectors, bringing them together to think cross-sectorally on how they can drive this agenda. So again, it's baby steps. In carbon, we've been doing the carbon finance quantification for, 12, 15 years, and we're now, the debate at this COP is how do we go from the inputs, the money in, to the outcomes, the GHGs reduced and the resilience achieved. Here we're back at that first step of how do we quantify the money in, but it's a vital step and we're excited about it, not just for MDB cohesion and expansion and innovation, but also how we can trigger the private capital markets and private enterprise to do more in this space.
Jamie, thank you very much. And I'm really, really enjoying hearing that blend of vision, detail, and institutional reaction to the challenge and the mission that you're setting out. So thank you ever so much. So Yoko, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure being here from representing the Asian Development Bank here as a new director of environment. I'm actually 3 months into my job, and actually I'm the newest member of the MDBs Nature Heads, and I'm actually really happy that I have found a family as I joined the Asian Development Bank and the larger MDBs group. And I really have to say this is an opportune moment that we all come together and have a discussion about the common principles on nature positive investment, going beyond the sort of traditional way that we were working on with safeguards and other things in the past. I think this is a huge step forward in terms of MDB's collective efforts to move this agenda forward. And I think starting from Glasgow, we have an opportunity with a Kunming Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework to bring us all together to really reach the 30 to 30 goals together. And I think this is an opportune moment that with also the climate change crisis in a way, we are actually very well positioned that we bring about the nature agenda moving forward in the discussion in climate change as well as in the biodiversity and nature discussion itself. And I really feel that, and also in Asian Development Bank, this is not a new area of work. We've been working on this for 20 plus years. But this is the first time, actually, that the Asian Development Bank made a concerted effort saying, we're going to have a full-time director like me to push this agenda forward together with all the other MDBs and others. So I'm just really looking forward to pushing this agenda forward together with all of you. And I think, as many of you said, there is sort of a couple of bucket or couple of pillars that we have in agenda moving forward with this. So one is really the nature-based solutions and also, in a way, mainstreaming nature in the productive sort of sectors and infrastructures and others that we are working with. So in case of ADB, we've been working on agriculture sector to make it more regenerative agriculture, or we've been working with infrastructure. We've been working on green infrastructure, making overpass and underpass for wildlife corridor development. We just developed actually a Bangladesh railway which with a wildlife corridor with an elephant, and we just saw the elephant actually crossing this pathways, and we were really excited about it. And so there's many ways to mainstream it, but also at the same time, as we are talking today, there are many ways that we can do a direct nature positive investment. And for that reason, we are working more on ecosystem restoration, ecosystem conservation. Coastal resilience and coastal management is something that we are really putting efforts on. One of the key program that we have is the Ocean Resilient and Climate Adaptation Program. And we're working with the regional countries to save corals, save the coastal lines, so that we can really address the climate change adaptation issue, but at the same time really address the important biodiversity and nature agenda in many of these countries. Another really positive spin is that we really need to work on a landscape and seascape level to work on these. Project by project, investment is not really going to work. So from that perspective, we are actually working with BirdLife International and others on a regional flyway initiative where we see the East Asia flyway to Australia, to the Russia border, to figure out how we can conserve wetlands as a means to adapt to climate, but also to ensure that our critical ecosystem and critical wetland, which has both impact to biodiversity as well as climate change, can be addressed in a more systematic way on a flyway, using the flyway as a means to generate interest from the countries and the regional scale. And that actually leads to my sort of another area is that we really need to generate interest and opportunities at the country level. We can't be supply driven from the MDB end. And there is a real interest and I think opportunity that is coming from the country level based on the global framework, global biodiversity framework and others. And we are actually at Asian Development Bank working with many country governments in our team on the ground to develop a country strategy that incorporates more strategically how we can invest on nature together with climate. And I think this is a really important way for upstream consultation with the government on policy issues and have a more strategical long-term investment views on these issues. And then the second point is finance. I mean, as I think the IFC colleague already mentioned as well, but there is a huge opportunity from the private sector to invest on this. And we're very much delighted that this week in COP28, we were able to launch the new Nature Solutions Finance Hub, which we are aiming to generate $2 billion up till 2030 to invest in more nature-based solutions and invest on a more blended finance, blue-green bonds, and also impact-based investments and other means, so that we're not really relying just on sovereign resources, but also on the non-sovereign as well as innovative solutions, so that we can scale up these initiatives in the next height. And I really think that MDBs have that sort of leveraging point and a collective sort of power to do that, and also bringing in that government as well as private sector and civil society sort of interests to bring this to a next level. And while we're talking about billions of dollars, I really actually want to bring this again to the ground level, where we really need to look at how can we use these nature-based solutions or nature-based actions towards co-benefit for local communities and indigenous peoples, because the way that we can really work on this can make a huge difference to improve the local communities' livelihood and their well-being. So Asian Development Bank really look forward to working with all the MDBs here, and it's been a great journey working on this common principles. And I think there is a whole lot more to be done to really apply this in our own system and track and monitor the investment that we're making on nature. And that's not an easy way to do, but we are up to the challenge and come up with a clear target and indicators so that we can really inform our taxpayer as well as our stakeholders, so that we are making not a baby step, but I think we can really make a stride if we all work together on this agenda together. So with that, thank you so much again for having us here, and I'm really looking forward to working further. Thank you.
Thank you, Yoko. You're clearly going to be a great addition to the family, and thank you very much indeed for that. And thank you for also starting to point out some of the stuff that's hard and going to be longer term as well, because I think it's important we're talking about those both. So, JP, over to you. Thank you from AIIB.
Thank you for having me. So, many of the speakers spoke about the journey they have taken, but let me just share with you that in AIIB, the journey is very compressed. We started operations in only 2016, and we have to learn so much and catch up so much and do so much in a very compressed time. I've been with the bank for 7 years, and let me share with you some of the journey. AIB started out trying to fill an infrastructure gap in Asia. Now, Asian Development Bank estimates that Asia needs to spend $1.7 trillion to $2 trillion per year on just meeting infrastructure needs. And that is the context. That's the context that AIB has been set up to do. Now think about it for one moment, right? If $1.7 trillion to $2 trillion comes in the form of steel and concrete, highways and roads and all these things pouring into nature, I think the effects is going to be very difficult for nature. It's very difficult to see how it's going to be sustainable in the long run. So very quickly, we traveled the journey and we realized that this cannot be done in the same way as we do infrastructure in the past. So we very quickly get around to working with various MDBs and trying to find a way forward that manage this infrastructure bill more sustainably. And I will quote from my president to say something like, he said something that touched me quite a lot. He says that it's time to reconcile with nature. We cannot keep asking it for more. And that is the words that he gave when we launched our infrastructure, Nature as Infrastructure report that was released about a week ago when Valerie kindly attended the panel. Let me highlight one or two side points first before coming back to the main topic itself, right? So in the report, there is a tension. Now, the first tension that I mentioned is that there is still a continuous need to invest in large amount of infrastructure. Gray infrastructure is still needed, a lot of it. right? Highways, Asia needs a lot of connectivity, and this is going to affect nature, and we're going to find some solutions. We said a lot of these things in our report. Second thing, in our report, we also bring out the tension between climate change finance and nature finance, primarily in the field of the development of renewable energy sources. Our team geospatially mapped all the renewables projects coordinates before and after through time into the Biodiversity Intactness Index, the BII. And of course, we find that a lot of renewable projects are actually occurring in places in the wild. Why? Because simply the yields, the wind yields, the sunlight yields are higher in places that are less developed, in places that are far away, in places that are out there, right? So the chase for yields, the chase for climate change financing, could actually end up contradicting, compromising in some way nature financing. And that is something that I think getting a sense of awareness, finding the right mitigation, and then reporting it right is going to be so useful. These are the two kind of tensions, high-level tensions of putting in more infrastructure and another tension of renewables. I want to take a special effort to thank World Bank. We benefited a lot from World Bank's data on the changing wealth of nations. Their evaluation of mangrove, their evaluation of forests, their evaluation of timber, non-timber, fossil fuels, so on, has been excellent. And I hear from them that they're making yet another iteration on the Changing Wealth of Nations report. They told me that they're going to send me the data in advance, and we're going to re-look again at all these issues and come back again. Okay, let me come back. What is the bank going to do? Having described all this tension and having been the latecomer MDB in this game, we're only 7 years old. We are catching up. It's a journey. We have traveled a long journey. Our president has committed to having a nature action plan by next year. Now, I do not yet know the finalized nature action plan. It's not been done yet, but I can already see some contours around what is going to be inside the nature action plan. I think speakers before me mentioned very well, do no harm, nature positive investments, and trying to find industry transformation. I can add a few more. I think direct financing for nature project has got to be core, and that's going to be done in a sovereign space. We are beginning to see China come to the bank for many nature restoration projects. River, estuaries, and and so on. Now, I ask myself, why is China coming in for so much? I realize that China is a little bit higher in the development journey curve. They have probably degraded their nature a little bit. And now, having achieved maybe $10,000, $12,000 per capita GDP, they're trying to pull back. And that's a good sign. Having attained a basic level of development, they are now looking at the harm they have done, and they're trying to come back, and we're seeing more projects from China. We may have to go to the shareholders to find policy-based lending tools. Again, AIB traveled the journey. We started out as a pure project financing bank, but that's not enough for nature. A lot of nature projects, you cannot just look at the project financing. You need to look at the policy context. So project policy-based lending, we're going to talk to the shareholders to have climate policy-based lending and possibly even have nature-based type of components in it. Lastly, I want to add a little bit to what Jamie said about IFC, about private sector. We have a kind of a transaction with a financial institution, on-lending financial institution, that says that if the farmers agree to not cutting down more forests, they're going to get the line of credit from AIIB, indirectly through FI, to do upgrading work, to buy machineries and so on. That is another modality that I can see that using the powers of the financial sector and working with partners in the financial sector, percolate the kind of nature positive, no net loss values through other partners in the financial system. I apologize, our nature action plan is not done yet. I could only speculate as some of the intelligently, hopefully, usefully speculate on some of the ingredients that may go in there. We look forward to working with the group here and on a journey ahead. Thank you very much.
Thank you, JP, and really great to hear that level of commitment and reflection and thoughtfulness about what that means for an institution like yours. So, Dauda, can I ask you to come to the floor from Islamic Development Bank? Thank you.
Thank you, and I will join my colleagues here to really congratulate EIB and IDB for their leadership in achieving this very important milestone. So at the Islamic Development Bank, as well, we are at the infancy in that sense, in that journey. We are almost 50-year-old, not 7, but I would say that we had an exercise 2 years ago of looking at our portfolio to see what are the aspects of nature-based solutions. And we saw that we had really projects that had nature-based solutions embedded in those. But now we understand that we need to look at it at a more systematic way. And the joint statement with the MDBs was really a wake-up call for us. And it helped us introduce it within the bank by just signing the statement and by having our higher management questioning the statement to understand what is it about, what are the implications for the bank. So it started the whole journey. And now we are looking at integrating nature by developing an approach, yes. Looking at the do no harm, we have environmental and social safeguard policy, and we are operationalizing it, integrating that aspect. We are also looking at our tagging system within the bank. We're using it for different purposes, but we are looking at the aspect of, we have a sustainable finance framework that we use for green bond, green sukuk issuance. And through that framework, we already have green finance, elements of projects that have that green finance. But we need to do more. We need to go more granular. And we need to look at how we will tag in our project system, how we will tag these aspects of nature-based solution, nature-positive investment, so that we can ultimately, when we go to our corporate result framework at the sector level, integrate those aspects. So those are baby steps compared with what I heard here. But this is a journey of the Islamic Development Bank, and it shows as well the heterogeneity and diversity within the MDB group, but hopefully with the help of everyone here, the same way we have leapfrogged in our climate journey, we will be able to catch up in the next few years. Thank you.
Thank you, Dauda. And again, I think we all recognize here the efforts that each one of our colleagues are making in terms of taking that mandate, understanding their institution and championing it through their institution in the ways in which their institution can respond best for the greatest possible impact. And I've been really pleased to hear that throughout. That's the end of the narratives from our colleagues within the MDBs. We're just now going to turn to Sandrine Dixon from the Club of Rome, who's going to give us a little bit of a perspective from her point of view about what MDBs need to do to be supporting nature-positive investments. Sandrine, thank you very much.
Thank you so much for, first of all, inviting me. Some of you may or may not be familiar with the Club of Rome, but 50 years ago we published The Limits to Growth, which in some ways has evolved into an understanding that not only do we need to finance change, but we also need to change our financial architecture. I've been very proud to work with the MDBs, in particular the EIB most recently, on a taxonomy program, particular on environmental taxonomy at the European level. And I'm really very pleased to see these principles and the MDBs coming together on harmonized and alignment around nature-based principles. what we saw through the taxonomy process was how difficult it is to align ourselves on criteria. And I think that if the MDBs are able to really get behind core principles on what is purposeful investment when it comes to nature-based solutions, that already is moving us in the right direction. So that is one point. However, I would like to urge, and this is part of our own reflection, a real discussion around a system which is broken. You all work within the MDBs, and you know yourselves as part of the financial architecture that we now live within an over-financialized economy, which actually means that our economy is no longer servicing the needs of people and planet or prosperity, but fundamentally servicing the needs of shareholder value. And that is why the MDBs are so important. That's why when we think about nature positive, we also have to think about debt for nature swaps. We have to think about debt cancellation. We have to think about SDRs. Because what we need to do is create the fiscal space to actually enable the Global South to make the right decisions as they start to protect the nature that we so want them to protect, but also invest in nature-based solutions. I sat on the task force for nature markets, and the big discussion that we're having now, and I think this follows the taxonomy discussion, is what type of governance frameworks do we need to have for nature markets? What does that look like? How can we bring in the principles to enable us to make sure that we don't continue to enable over-commodified nature markets rather than nature markets that truly protect nature? And maybe then, and that's my second point, the third point is the following. With Johan Rockström, climate scientist, and others, we've just published a book called Earth for All, A Survival Guide for Humanity. And the work that Johan has done on the planetary boundaries is so fundamental, and I know has been integrated as well in some of the work that we've done with the MDBs in terms of thinking how we can stay within the safe operating space of the planetary boundaries. But the big aha moment as we used our system dynamic model to assess the planetary boundaries and how we can ensure that we stay within the safe operating space was that the speed and scale of really maintaining a safe operating space within the planetary boundaries is directly linked to inequality and poverty. Therefore, even when we talk about nature markets, even when we talk about climate markets, even when we talk about decarbonization, if we don't fundamentally come back to social tipping points and impacts with regard to inequality and poverty, we will not be able to move forward and stay within the planetary boundaries. So I will end on that. And I very much hope that we can continue to work together, because we all know that we need to put in place usable systems, systems that have the right criteria, that also enable us to shift from just financing change, but changing the financial market so that it truly services people, planet, and prosperity at the same time. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sandrine, for that excellent challenge. So colleagues, hold on to those thoughts, hold on to the level of detail and ambition and change that our colleagues here presented. I'm now going to ask Eva to talk to us about next steps forward and her reflection. And as she comes up, can I just say, we should collectively say thank you again for her and Greg's work.
Thank you, and I think the congratulations should go through to all of us, because I remember Valerie and I in 2011, we were discussing finance tracking, right? And We were being urged by the OECD and the Swiss government in particular to be thinking about it. We tried our best, but we managed within the space of 1 year, when you consider the amount of time it took for the joint methodology on climate finance. And I think we deserve all a big round of applause, and it's not just myself and Greg, but it's all of us. I think what the common principles is not only a baby step, but I think it's foundational in the sense that it will allow us to put nature at the heart of transition plans and make sure that those transition plans are just and resilient. But also, I mean, some of the elements that Jamie evoked in terms of unlocking private finance for nature, looking at different systems and the markets that Sandrine mentioned, and making sure that, you know, those social issues are integrated, because I think Valerie, in her introduction, clearly said, I mean, it's poverty, development, climate, and nature. They all go hand in hand, and they're all interlocked. So when we are thinking actually of the taxonomy, we are looking at it from a systems approach. We are looking at it from a holistic perspective. So it's not nature in isolation, and I think that's also something that the group has come to realize and has been advocating. Then also what we've been working on, and especially with regards to the common principles, it also allows us to drive nature action through financial regulation and governance, and that's also something that both Jamie and JP have certainly alluded to. In terms of next steps, I think Graham quickly mentioned now we will work on a draft taxonomy, on the criteria, together with other partners, because everything has to be done in partnership. But we've already set a bar, at least we've got a definition for nature-positive finance, and that is very important. There are so many initiatives all around talking about nature-positive, but I think we've finally defined it, and we've set a direction, and hopefully others will follow. Then the next piece of work that will take a little more time, because we've now set the baseline with the input, we will have to think of outcomes. And I think Graham and both Yoko mentioned it's about impact and the impact of our financing. But for that, I think we all acknowledge that nature indicators or biodiversity indicators are wholly inadequate at the moment, and that is a big piece of work that we will need to actually come together and work on. And so that's one of the way forwards that we're thinking. So first thing is getting the taxonomy, piloting that taxonomy for some of us, others are different stages of maturity, but the common principles are not set in stone. They will require refinement as we gain more experience, and then we will start working on impact. So I'll leave it at there, but I'd like to also congratulate all my MDB colleagues, because it was a joint effort and it was not just the two of us. So.
Thank you, Eva, and thank you for touching on some of those core themes. And I think you've set a baseline, but I think you're starting to set a bar. And I've also really enjoyed hearing people use the phrase, it will allow us to, it enable us to. So seeing these principles as a multiplier, a motivator, and asking, hopefully, for forgiveness as well as permission at times. So colleagues, that was a really rich set of presentations. I know there's going to be great expertise and experience also in the room. What I'd like to do is just offer the chance for any questions to our panel and to colleagues who've joined us back on the seats here, and just test some of those ideas going forward. So, Jamie, there's a microphone just there. Thank you. But it's right, they'll sort it out. So if you would like to ask a question, I've got one gentleman there. I'll take a round, and then I'll put it to the panel. Thank you. And if you could introduce yourself as well when you speak, that would be very helpful. Thank you.
Hi. Does this work? Okay, now it does, yeah. My name is Stian Reclev. I'm a journalist with Carbon Pulse. I think like around about 20 years ago, when the carbon market started, several of the MDGs, and in particular the World Bank, played a very important role in the beginning of that market by providing funds and expertise and so on. And I was just wondering what sort of expectations we should have in regards to the role MDGs might be playing now, as biodiversity credits is emerging as a potential new huge financing factor for nature.
Great, thank you very much. Other questions from the floor? Yes, good, thank you. Lady at the back there.
Hi, my name is Sivan Ross. I'm from the UN Principles for Responsible Investment. And maybe a bit of a pendant to that question, I was wondering, to your respective institution, you've talked about the different type of financing that would qualify. Which ones do you foresee playing the biggest part in terms of having that nature positive impact? Is it financing positive impact, or is it addressing the negative impact from the rest of your financing?
Great, thank you. One more question before we turn to the panel? If not, we'll start with that, and I'm going to look at the panel and ask you to volunteer yourselves to answer that question. Valerie, would you like to start? Thank you.
I mean, on the biodiversity markets, the one thing that we're really going to be looking at, the same as we did for the carbon markets, is on benefit sharing and seeing where the money goes. Because one of the conversations we don't talk about enough, though it's really gathering steam, thankfully, is how much indigenous peoples, local communities, small-scale farmers, small-scale fishers, are actually the people who manage the landscape, who manage the biodiversity. And if we do end up creating biodiversity credit markets, we need to make sure that the financing goes to the people on the front lines who are doing the work and on whom we have put a huge amount of pressure to protect biodiversity at sometimes very large opportunity costs for them. In terms of responsible investing, I think the thing we're most excited about that we think can have an outsized impact is repurposing subsidies. Just on agricultural subsidies alone, it's $635 billion every year. That's very close to the biodiversity financing gap of $700 billion a year. That will take down that financing gap. It will reduce the cost of saving biodiversity. And if we not eliminate subsidies, but repurpose them so that the same farmers can get the same amount of money, but to do things that promote biodiversity, to talk about agroforestry, to invest in intensification, not extensive agriculture, then we can actually end up using those subsidies as a way to accelerate nature-positive finance instead of what it's doing right now, which is really diminishing biodiversity and the ability of us to bring all of those small-scale farmers into partnership with us as champions for biodiversity.
Great, thank you, Valerie. Jim.
Thanks. Just to add, so Dion, thanks for acknowledging the role on the carbon credits. We're not there yet on carbon credits. We continue to be actively engaged in trying to drive that market towards high quality, and carbon has the unique attribute of being the utterly fungible commodity, right, of a ton of GHG, and nature is at the absolute inverse end of that scale. So I'm more bullish and excited about the role, as I said earlier, we can play in terms of contributing to the taxonomy and the driving of capital into nature finance rather than credits per se in the medium term. In terms of I'm sorry, I didn't hear your name, but on the UN principles, just to build on what Valerie said for the World Bank Group's interpretation of these principles and our approach. So, the do no harm is embedded in everything we do, in our safeguards, the IFC's performance standards. They're all harmonious, and that's core for us. Performance standard 6. So when it's triggered, it's 100% of our business at one end. The other end, we're talking about the nature positive. The bit where we think we are excited and will do significant work is the bit in the middle, which Valerie described as the nature mainstreaming. And that for us, from a private sector perspective, is the bit we're excited to quantify, measure, and expand. And I think that will be more relevant to your membership.
Great. Thank you very much indeed, Jamie. Any other questions from the floor? I have one. So let me just whiz round each of the speakers, including you, Eva, if you could. I'm really interested to know, you've all talked about the progress that you're making and the leadership that you're showing and the family that you're part of. I'm really interested to know what you need from others around you, right? What do you think you need to support you within your institutions, individually or collectively, to move this forward, to meet the principles at their maximum ambition, to meet that sort of, ultimately that point of properly integrating climate, nature and development at the country level in a meaningful way for local communities. So you can either choose to answer that or you give me a reflection from what you've heard today. So Dauda, I'm going to start with you if I can, which is perhaps a bit unfair, but let me get you the mic. Thank you.
Yes. What do we need? As an institution? No, I think, like I said, it's a matter of now structuring it a little bit more, systematizing it, and also having it as part of an action plan within the bank that would be followed. I think now we are at the stage of setting up the systems. And it's a very good timing because there are a few systems that are still under construction, and this will just fit in, and it will help in our discussion, our engagement with our member countries. And the good thing is, right now, there's also very good initiatives coming from the ground. We have the Middle East Green Initiative, which is going to put 2.5 billion over 10 years, supporting many countries that we are covering, and on reforestation, recovery, and things like that. So really, we will just fit in. And now I think that the next 12 months, 18 months is going to be about finalizing these and setting up the procedures internally. But we have the buy-in of the management, which is already very good.
Great, thanks, Dauda. So both timing and capturing momentum is really helpful. JP, can I start with you and we'll work our way down?
Hi, thank you. I think the political momentum is very important. I think all the MDBs, with our narrative, with our common framework, common principle, I think the important is to sustain the kind of political narrative about the importance of sustaining nature. Now, this gives us the mandate to talk to the shareholders, to change our financing instruments to address nature, and more fundamentally, it asks the shareholders to say that, hey, think about conserving nature, think about starting projects that conserve nature and bring it to the MDB for financing, both sides of the coin. I think the political momentum is important to give cover to work and push us to push our shareholders and them to push us as well towards more financing for nature. Let me take just a minute to address the point of scaling up nature positive financing, right? Now, we have been on a long multi-decade of journey to try to crowd in private sector financing, private sector mobilization into traditional grey infrastructure. Now, you can argue whether or not that effort has been successful, the billions to trillions. You can argue that it hasn't. But what I'm trying to describe to you is that it has always been an effort to find the kind of financial structure, the kind of PPP structure, the kind of policy structure to crowd in, right? That effort must be done for nature as well. Right? We must find the kind of financing structure to crowd in, whether it's called mainstreaming or to crowd in the private sector into co-investing in nature. That's going to be difficult. No revenue streams or no everything. We've got to think about philanthropic capital. We've got to think about doing some first loss. We have to think about carbon credits that act as the revenue stream. Carbon or bio credit that then act as a revenue stream in order to mobilize more private sector investors. A lot of work lies ahead before we scale up. I hope to answer that question. And then this is the kind of work that MDBs are well suited to do. Experiment, find the right structure, work with the different stakeholders, whether the government, the regulators, or the private sector. I think IFC, World Bank, and ADB, we have all done that, and try to do that and try to scale up. Thank you.
Thank you very much, JP. Valerie, you've got 5 minutes and 5 people, so go ahead. Thanks.
So very quickly, I think what we need are three things among all the actors working in this nature space. The first is partnership, not cynicism, not skepticism. Work with us instead of against us. Don't see us as the enemy, work with us. The second thing we need to do is we need to mature our approach beyond always talking about financing green projects. We really need to start talking about investing in green economies. Sandrine said it, and that means looking across the supply chain of finance, working in partnership in the same landscapes. And I think the final thing we really need to do is, too often, frankly, when we talk about nature and working with indigenous peoples, working with local communities, we're working with them in order to benefit nature. It's a Trojan horse for old-fashioned nature conservation. We need to shift that around and remember that nature and natural capital is an engine of poverty alleviation. It's an engine of shared prosperity. We can do it sustainably, so we need to rethink our focus.
That's fantastic. Thank you, Valerie. Joko.
Maybe I'll focus on two things. So one is actually, I think there is a lot of interest and demand from the private sector to invest on it, but there's not enough sort of pipeline projects, which is generating revenue and a bankable, in a way, quote unquote, projects. And I think those are something that we were just discussing before I came here to this panel, that there are a lot of, experiences from the NGOs and others that have experiences in developing these. And how can we translate that so that we can learn lessons from it and develop a really scalable sort of investment program? And to do that, I have to admit that in the MDBs world, we really need people in our organization who can speak both sort of biodiversity, nature, and finance. And so, we have either side of people, but people who can talk both is something that, this community really have to invest a little bit more and nurture that. And actually that goes to the government side or the stakeholder side too, because I've been working with a lot of Ministry of Environment people, and as soon as you talk about financial mechanism and bonds and credits, people kind of get lost. So, we also need that, both side of sort of capacity building to enable this. And, we can't just be supply driven in many cases. And we need to also look into a little bit more longer term in terms of capacity building and really come up with, not a project by project, but a real sort of a portfolio approach in terms of investing in it in a more scalable manner.
Great, thanks, Joko. Graham.
Just to kind of answer the other questions as well, or replicate a little bit the answers, I think we need to work on the supply side, and that supply side is also about impact and quality of the supply side, but also about how the flows, the actual finance flows to the owners, the real owners of land. But I actually think the main challenge is how do you create the markets? That's the big area that needs to change. They exist in some places, but there's still a huge amount of work that needs to be done to actually bring this to scale. The question on if you go to another scale, so the second question actually was really about how do you go from MDBs doing no harm. You actually need to spread that to everybody doing no harm. That's actually a policy and planning question within the country. So the country needs to take that decision, replicating what we're trying to do. That's a much bigger kettle of fish, but it needs to happen. That also needs to happen if you want nature positive investing too. If you don't have the policy frameworks in the country, you won't get nature positive investing. I mean, we're not designed, the countries are not designed, the policy systems, the planning systems are not designed to deliver that. And of course, they are in fact designed to deliver the opposite through the subsidies. So that what has to change. And that's a huge transformation. So in answer to your question, who do we need? We need the countries. And we need the countries to really buy into this agenda to be able to move the agenda forward. And ultimately, the countries are us, because they're our board. So they can tell us what to do, but ultimately, at the end of the day, we're going to be working with the countries to be able to make these changes.
Great, thanks, Graham. Jamie.
Sticks and carrots. Sticks, nature, like climate, is a global public good. Unless the oxymoron of global international law gives it some teeth and some national law gives it some teeth, private markets will never internalize nature into their decision making. So if we want to move at scale, we need to give a value to nature, and that can only happen if you regulate it, right? That's the stick. The carrot, For an MDB like ourselves, we are a systemic investor. That means we have public ambition, but we operate in a market. We have to persuade our clients. We have to offer them value that they are persuaded by. We can't do anything without clients. So we need to add value in this space, and unless nature is seen as a value-added proposition through labeled lending, labeled bonds, blended finance to tempt them to go beyond what the regulations are, we won't move the market. Sticks and carrots.
Great, thank you. Can I just take that? Yes.
Thank you. And then just to follow on what Graham said, and I'm taking an introverted approach a little bit, is our shareholders, right? I mean, there's still, there's a bit of schizophrenia between impact and volume. So looking at nature finance is very impactful. The volumes may not be high, but it's certainly more impactful than some of the volume that we are financing. So that's, and also a plea to the shareholders, give us the resources. Because if you think of the amount, looking at the biodiversity specialists in the different MDBs, it's just a small group. We'd really appreciate the resources. But on this note, I'd like to thank everyone. I'd like to thank the FCDO, certainly for pushing us, for keeping us, on the right track. I think it was thanks to the UK FCDO that really, pushed the agenda and actually brought the agenda to our boards. So I think for a number of MDBs, maybe not all, but certainly this has been really, really important, and we hope to continue working together, but also working together with all of you. Just reiterating what Valerie said, we can only deliver on this agenda if we work together and not against each other. So thank you all for coming. Thanks.